orchard and I wanted to learn how to create my own tree and have some of those varieties. So that's what kind of propelled me to learn. And yeah, just been trying to teach other people how to do it. So I have about 20, 30 trees, live between Woodinville and Duval. And it's a nice little hobby, especially in the fall when the fruit's ripe. Okay, so let's go to the first slide. I'm not able to advance it. Rosie's going to come in and.
Hold on. Oh, why is that not working? Okay, now just.
Is that the,
yeah.
that the first
okay.
one? Okay.
Sorry, guys.
So on most fruit trees, there's always two parts. There's a root system and a variety. And the primary reason, well, I'll move on. So on the rootstocks over the years, probably since around the the 1910s and forward, fruit tree growers, commercial growers, particularly in England, there was no systematic organization of rootstocks. So people, when they didn't know what they were going to get tree size wise. So now the different rootstocks, a lot of times they'll control the size of the tree, but also different rootstocks are suitable for different types of soils. So the rootstock, it offers a lot of options for people. And one thing that can happen, sometimes there's incompatibility between the host and the scion. On the left, that looks more like a strong union there. The other side, you can tell, or on the right, there's kind of a barrier developing, and I would say over a long term, that union will fail. So the reason I mention this, say for example, with sometimes people want to graft pear onto a quince rootstock to dwarf the tree, but quince is not compatible with some pear varieties. So that's something to be aware of. When you're collecting rootstock, when you're collecting scions, or if somebody's giving you some scions, it's important. What you want to do is you want to graft with the wood. When you're doing your grafting in the spring, you want to do it with wood that grew last summer. So on the left is that's like last year's bud, and you can tell. What you do is you go down the branch until you come to the point on the right, and that's called the bud scar. That's where the growth started last year. So if you go down the branch beyond that point, you're getting into 2-year-old wood. So that's something to be aware of. Also, you don't want to use wood below the bud scar from last year. That makes sense? And another indicator of wood that's past 1 year old, I should say on the wood that's 1 year old, most of the buds are vegetative buds. If you start seeing more prominent buds, like these fruit buds on the left-hand side of the picture, then you're getting into more mature wood. If it has fruit buds, more than likely, it's not 1 year old wood. something else to be aware of when you're collecting or picking up scions is the diameter. A lot of times the rootstock that you're going to be grafting onto is going to be comparable diameter to a pencil. Sometimes it can be a little more, a little less, but this is a nice size to work with. And I guess what I'm trying to say is you want to match the diameter of the scion wood with the diameter of the rootstock at the point where you're going to graft, so you can get a good mating of the two surfaces. But also, if you collect your own scion wood, I try to cut it longer than you need. For example, a lot of times you're only going to need 6 inches or so, or really it's kind of difficult to graft with scions that are over 6 inches long. They're more awkward to work with. So I'll try to cut my scions maybe at least a foot, maybe longer. And that gives you more flexibility to match the diameter of your rootstock. And also there's less chance of the scion wood dehydrating. And sometimes you can make 2 scions out of one long one. Well, this is the say pre-modern polymers and paint and so forth. This is say back in the 1800s. This is how they would seal a scion. We'll talk about sealing ours later, but they would wrap it with let's see. Well, I'm trying to read here. Well, they would bond it with something and then put the wax around it to seal in the moisture. That's the old-fashioned way. These days, some of the tools that I use, kind of going from 12 o'clock clockwise, grafting seal, but you can use, say for example, latex paint. You don't want to use anything with an oil base. If you use latex paint, you want to make sure there's enough time for the paint to dry. If you're getting close to a point where you might get precipitation, tags to label your scion with a variety. There's a little plane to smooth out the graft surface. Grafting knife, which we'll talk about a little bit more. If we don't have a slide on the grafting knife, well, let me point it out right now. Grafting knife typically is beveled on one side of the blade. And like most kitchen utensils are beveled on 2 sides. Just having one side of the knife beveled gives you a truer, straighter cut. If you were to try to cut with a blade with bevels on both sides, it tends to want to wander. Bypass pruners. The orange tool is an omega grafter. It just kind of it punches in an omega shape, and you bring together the male and female ends. It has its pros and cons. It's a lot quicker, but the graft union is fairly small, so it's not as strong. It can tend to hinge on you if you're not careful. Grafting band, latex gloves are, some people may want to use them, and we'll talk about why later. And tape to cover the grafting band so that sun does not deteriorate the band before the graft union heals. A lot of times what I'll do is nip off, like when you have your scion When I collect scions, usually I leave the terminal bud on the top end, and that automatically seals one end, and the other end I'll dip in some type of sealant to keep the moisture in. If you pick up scions at a fruit show like Mount Vernon or Seattle Tree Fruit or Snohomish, a lot of times they'll be dipped in wax, but even though they've been preserved on the cut end, a lot of times the cut end is a little bit dehydrated, so I'll cut the end off and to make sure it has plenty of vitality or moisture inside. Usually it's nice and green, and it should look like that. If it doesn't, if it's not green, just cut another ½ inch off. If it's not green looking, your graft is not going to work. So it depends. I should take that back a little bit. Sometimes different varieties have a little bit different colored wood inside. It's not necessarily that it's green, but you need to be able to feel like your scion is plenty hydrated for it to be viable. And really, what in the grafting process, what we're trying to match up is that green layer. We're trying to match up the green layer on both the scion and the rootstock, so that the vascular cambium, I think of it as like a conduit. It's a conduit for moisture, and you need to be able to supply moisture to the scion in order for it to grow and heal. Now we're going to talk about the process of making the cut. I think one thing that's really important is to have a sharp knife. If you don't have a sharp knife, it's really hard to get a good clean cut. And one way to tell if your knife is sharp is to have a piece of, just a piece of regular paper, and you can take the knife. For example, you just take the knife and gently pull it across there, and it should cut like that. Okay. And the other thing is safety. What I try to do is I try to anchor my arms across my chest and pull parallel to my torso, so that the blade of the knife is traveling in a path where it's not going to cut me. And I try to control the stroke also. I'm just trying to think here. What we're trying to do is to make a diagonal cut about 1.25 inches long, and from one side to the other. Just keep moving the blade, moving, and usually you'll build up a little tension, and bammo, it'll slice off about halfway through.
Hey, Greg, were you showing us that there? And did you have that in your hands there?
No.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you were showing
us
something there.
These are all pictures.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you have something in your hands there, it's down below the camera. So, there you go. Now
nothing right now.
Okay. Okay.
If somebody feels like they need a demonstration, we can do that.
Okay.
At the end. Trying to figure out which way. Okay, there we go. Now, sometimes it doesn't quite cut as smooth as you want, so I try again. That's too short. And I was going to say, when you start cutting, you want to have enough scion length to leave yourself several chances. So for well, pretty soon, if you start exactly where you want to try and mate them together, you may whittle away the length of your scion to the point where, you know, you just run out of wood. So I try to start maybe a little bit at a little bit bigger diameter than I really need. And that gives me opportunities to get a second and a third chance. And when you're mating them together, the scion and the rootstock, all you really need to do is have a good match on one side. You know, the entire wound doesn't need to mate up perfectly. There's another view of a cut that is not smooth. In that case, you'd want to try another maybe shallow stroke, or you can take a little planer with a sharp blade like this and give it a couple strokes and shave away the imperfections. And one thing I need to point out, and this is like super critical, is and then this is where the latex gloves come in. If you use latex gloves, do not get the powdered ones. That if you touch the cut tissue on either the scion or the rootstock, the oils in our skin will kill the graft union. So you have to be really careful not to touch the wound area that you've opened up, because if you do, a strong chance your graft will not take. So give it a couple straight. I believe I did this on. I'm going to go back a couple. So we started out with this. We gave 1 or 2 strokes with the plane, and it makes it nice and smooth. Good mating surface. Just another angle, same shot. And that gives you an idea about the length. I think if the length is too short, the union loses some stability, and if you make it too long, you just you run out of grafting band and have to use more. I think like an inch to an inch and a quarter on a pencil thickness scion is a good length. One way to add stability to the union for when you bond it together with the grafting band is this is the 1.5 inch diagonal slice is called a whip. That's a whip graft. Now, if you put this little back cut in it, that's called whip and tongue. So here we're creating a tongue. You have to be, this is dangerous unless you're really experienced or you have a little shield like this. I'd highly recommend some type of shield if you want to put the tongue in so you don't slip and whack yourself, a good one. And what the tongue does, what you do that, you do this on both sides, and you kind of need to do it. You just have to experiment with this. If you don't have the tongue in the same spot on both, they won't mate up good. But the tongue kind of secures the scion to the host, and it makes it a lot easier to start wrap your grafting band. Here we're mating them together. As I had mentioned before, we just need one side to match together good. And take my glasses off so I can see close up. Oh, if you look down to your right somewhat, you can see an omega-shaped graft. Well, what we're doing here is the scion has, looks like it has like 6 or 7 buds on it. Usually you don't want to leave any more than 4 buds on your cyan, because when it leaves out, you'll have it'll create quite a demand on moisture or respiration. I don't know the term that leaves use, and the leaves may give off more moisture than the host is able to supply. So usually I cut it back to anywhere between, you want to leave at least 2 buds. I've seen people graft with 1, but they're very confident. 2, sometimes a bud doesn't always open up. Leave at least 2, and usually not more than 4 is a good rule. And then wrapping the wound, I'm trying to think here. So again, this must have been the one with the tongue. What you want to do is you want to get at least 1 wrap around. If you get 1 or 2 wraps on it, that gets you started. And as you get started, there's a tendency for the area you've made it together to dislodge a little bit. So what I try to do is get enough wrap on there where it's nice and firm, but then here we go, you can see it's dislodged as I've started to wrap it. At this point, it's you still have enough mobility with the wrapping that you can kind of slide that back over into position. Once you get it wrapped all the way, it's hard to tell how the mating of the 2 surfaces is. So I try to get them well matched up before I cover them entirely with the wrapping. And it's just showing how just kind of anchor probably the rootstock in your hand and swivel the cyan over until it's in the position you want it. Just a gentle motion. When you wrap the band, typically, I should say when you wrap the wound with a grafting band, I usually start at the bottom and rotate it, working my way up. You want to ideally you cover the entire wound. Yeah, what it does is it presses them together. So there may be times where the surfaces are not perfect, but by applying pressure with the band, it kind of brings them together. And you don't want to wrap it so tight that you're strangling it, but you want it tight enough where it's nice and firm. You want to say if somebody bumps it or a bird lands on it or whatever, you want it to be able to stay in place. Probably the trickiest part is when you get to the point where you want to secure the top of the band. Usually what I'll do is let me try and demonstrate this. Well, I'll flip this around. What I try to do is at the very end, oops, a second, let me get her started here. At the very end, I'll put my finger under the band and lift the band, bring the rubber band around and tuck it under like that. I'm not sure if everybody can see. Maybe we'll just look at the slides, but so you want to bring the band across your finger, the band under the finger, you'll draw outwards a little bit as the other end of the band is brought around by your other hand and slipped between the nail of my finger and the scion. If you have more questions about that, we can talk about it at the end. Just another shot of, I believe I'm slipping the band between my fingernail and the scion. It requires a little practice, some dexterity. I'm not sure what I'm doing here. This looks like it's almost been reversed. I think it's just a continuation of the same process, but it looks like I took this doing another graft because it just let me it looks different. But anyway, you get the idea, I hope. And then as you let go, you want to try and draw the tail of the band that has gone through the loop tight, just snug. You don't want to pull on it so much that you dislodge the scion from the union. That's what it should look like. There's a million different ways to do it. That's just the way I do it. And if you experience something, if you have a different technique that works good for you, then do it whatever way you feel like works best for you. I'm just trying to give you a basis to start with. And then, yeah, I put a little covering on, whether I used to use electrical tape, but that was kind of cumbersome. This, painter's tape, it comes off. It stays on, but it comes off easy. The main idea is to shield, even though the grafting band has been treated to withstand UV rays, I've found that, if you put them on in March, by the time, I think the soonest I'd like to take them off is, I've heard 4th of July, but I think that's kind of early. I usually wait until summer's, at least August. And the band has a tendency to deteriorate even though it's been UV treated. So I put a little shield on it. Just wrap it around, start at the bottom, and it kind of acts like a shingle to shed moisture if you start at the bottom and wrap it towards the top. Keep wrapping it around. It's a ton easier to graft rootstock. That's called bench grafting. If you're up in a tree, like the bench graft, you can rotate the rootstock, manipulate it easily. If you're up in a tree, you're just having to work at whatever angle that branch is offering you. So it's a lot easier to graft, I think, on the ground than up on a ladder or on a tree. And then the terminal bud on the lower of the two scions, the point is called the terminal bud. That has hormones in it that inhibit the sprouting of the scion bud. So you always want to cut that off. And usually I'll dab a little bit of sealant on the end, on the wound where I've cut the terminal bud off to inhibit dehydration, just like that. And then it's really a good idea to label them, label a variety, because a lot of times I forget. I think, okay, I'll remember this one, and 2 or 3 years later, I have to wait and see what kind of fruit it bears in order to tell what variety it is. Oh, by the way, metal tags are way better. Those like yellow plastic ones, they'll last a few years. I'd say the plastic outlast the ink on the label, but eventually they get brittle, break off. The metal ones last a long, long time. The only thing you'll need to watch out for is as the tree grows, you'll need to move the tag around because the branch diameter will outgrow the loop in the wire. The wire will start becoming embedded into the tree. I'm trying to think of a better word. Encapsulated into the wire gets encapsulated into the wood. And come probably, I'd suggest August, you could take your grafting bands off, and it should look like this, where things are all pretty well healed up. Now you can kind of tell the pressure on the grafting bands has kind of created little creases in the wood, but that's fine. That'll all it'll become uniform in a short time. And probably, if you look closely, you can probably visualize where that diagonal cut used to be. That's the other side. One thing I'll show you here is that the wound itself never really heals, the woody part of the wound. What happens is that the wound gets encapsulated by new tissue, and it just heals over. The wound always stays in there. And I'm not, it depends on your, I'm talking about when it should sprout. You know, it depends on the variety. It depends on the year we're having temperature wise. Hopefully, what you don't want to do is if you've grafted rootstock and like put them in pots, or you put them out wherever you're going to put them, a couple things. Like in pots, you don't want to put them where they're going to get hot afternoon sun. It'll cook them, cook the scions. Probably morning sun, afternoon shade. And if you put them out in the wherever you want it to grow, actually, I'd say that's probably not a good idea to get your rootstock or to graft your rootstock and put it right out in the field. I'd get it started at least a year or two. The downside is, you know, you need to water the pot, and I found in the wintertime you're going to need to put, if you leave the pot above, well, if you just leave the pot sitting on the ground and we get some cold weather, roots tend to freeze back. They'll freeze back. Say you're dealing with a 12-inch wide pot and we get some real cold weather, the roots, the pot's this wide, the roots may freeze back half. So it'd be good to half bury the pot or put some straw around it or something like that to protect it from freezing. If you have any animals, they can be tough on them, or people with weed whackers or something like that. You just need to protect it for a few years until it you know, gets a little bit of a size to it. So I'd say by May you should be seeing this. If you've grafted the middle to the end of March, yeah, by May you should see this. Oh, one other thing I forgot at the very start, what you don't want to graft with scions that have started to grow vegetation. That's more than likely they've used up enough energy already where it's gonna be a hard time to have them be viable. You want to start out with dormant scions. You want to make sure the surface of the wood is nice and supple, no wrinkles. I think that's like super critical, is to make sure you have a viable scion to start with. Yes, yeah, like cutting, like I had mentioned, cutting into the base. Make sure you have a you know, greenish, healthy looking, not budding out yet. Things like that are indications that your scion is healthy. And yeah, come say if you have sprout, well, eventually this is what you're looking for. One thing I point out is the extra vegetation off to the sides. Once you see your scion leaf out nicely, some of these lateral branches below the scion, you can trim those back so that the scion gets a little bit more, or a little bit less competition. You don't want your scion to get out competed by vegetation that you don't really need. It's not going to be useful. One thing also to be really important, if you're be cognizant of, is if you're harvesting scion wood from a orchard that has disease like anthracnose, and there's a chance that your scions are going to have the disease also. For example, this scion is going to die because the disease has killed off that green cambium layer that's going to supply nutrient to it. So be as careful as you can to not have a diseased scionwood. But by the time of the year that you're grafting, the disease usually hasn't really come out of dormancy, so it's really hard to tell if it has a disease or not. I think your best indication is if other trees have disease around it, then there's a chance you have disease on your scion. Omega grafting tool, talked about that briefly. What it does is you kind of center the omega shaped cutting head on your scion, punch it through. Let me go back one. Whoops. Oh, so like on your omega cutting head, they come in different sizes, but you want to make sure your scion wood is thick enough to accommodate the omega shape. On this one here, the omega was bigger than the scion, so you really don't have any structure on the female end of the host to support it. Whereas here you can see that the scion was a little thicker. What you're going to do is you're going to make a cut. Well, you're going to have to reverse the tool or reverse the wood. The omega shape of the cutting head, you want to create a male and a female end. Slides right in there. Nice form fit. Wrap that up. Match the cambium layers, wrap it up. Oh, this is maybe a good point to, or this is a good time to point out that when you are, actually I should have done this way before, but when you are aligning the orientation of your scion wood, the buds need to be pointing up. Say, for example, yeah, from the rootstock, your vegetative buds on your scion need to be pointing upward. If you graft them on with the buds facing downward, that green cambium layer isn't going to transport fluid. It's just it's a one-way transportation of fluid. So you want to make sure your buds are pointing upward. Pretty self-explanatory. Sorry, I didn't mention that sooner. This here is the a healed omega wound. And then there's other types of grafting. This is the bark graft, usually on more where you're trying to mate scion 1-year-old wood with more mature wood. You need to wait until the sap is flowing so you can pull the bark away on the host and slip the scion down in there. And this is a cleft graft. Pretty tricky because, well, actually my picture is kind of covering up part of the on the wrong way on the right. Well, okay, look down lower on the right where it says wrong. You can see where that green cambium layer is not matching up. It's really important it's always important to get the green layers matched up. Bud graft, this is done later in the year, say usually August. Again, you need to cut a notch about the same size. I think on the left, you'd take a vegetative bud from this summer's growth, and then you'd graft it onto grafted on, well, I'm trying to think, if you're grafting on a rootstock, most of the time commercially this is grafted onto rootstock. So you just make you try to make the diameter or the size of your cut, the depth of your cut, match the bud. The bud grafting is probably a whole class in itself. We'll look at a couple more shots here. So after you mate the bud to the host, you wrap it up really good because the bud is small enough where it'll dehydrate in a day or two. So you're trying to seal that moisture in on the left and on the right. If you do a good job, it'll grow like that. And this is towards the end. There's been a number of times where I have lost track of the new grafts, and about 2 or 3 years later, when I'm pruning my trees, I accidentally cut one off. So where I've grafted a new variety on, I usually put some flagging tape, survey tape, and that helps remind me that's a graft there and not just excess vegetative growth. And that's everything. Did we open up things for questions?